All righty. So, in the course of a true financial planning relationship, you get to know your families pretty well. In fact, I've said and been told by clients that we know more about them than actually anyone else that they know. But sometimes it takes years for stuff to come out of the closet that they just don't feel like parting with, whether they're embarrassed or uncomfortable or whatever it is. And that has to do with some dark stuff that lives in the closet, whether it's illness, abuse, or other issues that have happened. We, in the last year, have encountered many situations where there were issues that needed resolving that were beyond our control, ability, or capabilities. I ran into the Arden Professional Group through a professional association of lawyers, accountants, etc., and said, geez, that's a really strong message. So without taking away from her message, let me say that we have some mental health professionals here to help you recognize issues and what your role could be or should be with respect to, frankly, helping the family immensely. And I got to tell you, whenever we reach down the family tree, up the family tree, or across the family tree, I can tell you in every situation, those are the binding moments that have them say, I'll never leave you. So, that said, I hope you get something out of this. Arden, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Well, thank you, everyone. I am very excited to be here. And I'll tell you, I'm particularly excited for two reasons. One is this room is freezing. So even if I'm awful, you're not going to fall asleep, even if you try, because it's so cold, that'll never happen. And the second reason, and this is more of the reason I'm very excited, is I'm actually presenting tomorrow evening in Colorado, which is very exciting at a beautiful dude ranch. And the presentation on addiction and mental health is coming right after the cocktail hour while dinner and wine is being served. So you can imagine, I know, who is going to be the least popular lady to talk to the whole evening? Raise your hand. So thank you very much. I am Arden O'Connor, the CEO of the O'Connor Professional Group. I'm lucky enough to be joined by my colleague Dave Kerrigan, who's in the back here. And we're doing a little filming because we've been told by our website advisors we do not have enough content on the website. So I'm here to provide that. So our company, O'Connor Professional Group, was started 8 years ago now. I started it based on a family story that I'll get into in a minute. But we are a behavioral health concierge service. So we work with high net worth families that have a range of issues from substance abuse and other types of addiction issues, what we call process addiction, so things like sexual compulsivity, gambling. We deal with mental health issues that range from anxiety and depression through schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. We work with eating disorders and autism spectrum disorder. And I'll get into what we do more specifically a little bit later, but we see your clients usually at their worst. So I always like to start out with, what do we as professionals serving high net worth clients tend to encounter when we work with family systems? We're coming right up against holiday time, and how many people have gotten a card like this in the mail around the holidays? And how many think that actually reflects the emotions in that family?
How many takes did it take to get that?
Exactly. Oh, the son who's, just coming upon his teenage years looking lovingly at his mother. I can remember on one hand how many times that happened with my brothers and my mom at that age. So what we like to say, this is closer to the reality of what we see. And I will tell you, this would be a dream scenario for a lot of clients we serve because everyone's still wearing makeup and looks very, very attractive and all put together. But I think it gets to the point of, one of the issues that we've had getting clients to sign up for our services or even to spread the word about what we do is families don't want to talk about hidden secrets and things like medical issues. So if someone gets a cancer diagnosis, I actually had one years ago and my parents ran to everybody they knew at Dana-Farber, the head of the board, who's the best doctor, how do we deal with this? When it comes to things like mental health issues or substance abuse issues, that level of openness is not there. And a lot of times families are trying to protect some version of what their reality looks like. So we're going to start with a case study about a young man named Chris who was diagnosed with ADHD in his adolescence. and struggled with a traumatic brain injury. This is actually a picture of Chris. You wouldn't have known that he had a brain injury. He was in a skiing accident. He was chasing his friend on the ski slopes. His ski kind of hit the edge of the trail. He wound up going into a snowblower. He broke his neck, was able to be okay, but was in a halo for 3 months after that. And they said that the brain injury didn't necessarily impact his cognitive functioning. He was quite high IQ, but it impacted his already lowered impulse control. ADHD is often associated with kids who have impulse control issues. So this brain injury further impacted that. And Chris began at an early age of around 13 years old using alcohol and marijuana. The use progressed throughout his high school years. He managed to matriculate to college, but he wound up getting into more serious drugs while he was in college and had to drop out to go into a treatment center. So full disclosure, Chris is my brother, Chris O'Connor. He's 7 years younger than me. The name of the firm is O'Connor Professional Group, so can you guys guess what nationality we are? And I like to joke, especially when family is not in the room, that the O'Connor Professional Group could stay in business throughout eternity, just serving the family and friends group of the O'Connor family, because we're always trying to put someone into treatment or get someone help. So my brother Chris was predisposed towards addiction because of my father. My father's 30-some years in recovery. I have another brother, Matt, who also is in recovery. I'm not. I'm what they call in the field a normie, meaning I can drink within normal social limits. But I have a lot of family and friends that grew up around the disease. And my brother Chris, I think what was unique about his struggle in our family system is, one, he had not only the genetic predisposition. We know that kids whose fathers are alcoholics, boys particularly, are 4 to 6 times more likely to become alcoholics than if you were born and your dad wasn't one. But I think more particularly because of my brother's ADHD and impulse control issues, the highs for him became much more aggressive. So he was somebody who couldn't just really get his thrill from drinking too much, but he would go use cocaine at a very early age. He would then progress to marijuana. He progressed to eventually heroin. And in our family system, I was the firstborn. I was the one who did everything I was supposed to do. And my brother Chris was very much an experimenter. So if you look at prevention statistics, Chris started using alcohol and marijuana at 13 years old. His chances of becoming addicted to alcohol or marijuana were 42% based on that time frame because he started so young. I started drinking at 21 because I just did everything I was told and continue to be a nerd even at 41. And my chances of becoming addicted were down to 9%. So he was very much the poster child of somebody who had all the factors that led to a perfect storm. And Chris had a ton of risk-taking behaviors. So I always say this is not the worst picture of Chris. I don't like to show it because it's pretty graphic. And he never quite looked that good. That was my brother's wedding, and he never wore a tuxedo, I don't think, after that experience. But he was a young man who did extraordinarily well in school, was very gifted athletically, came with these genes, and eventually got himself into a lot of trouble in the criminal justice system due to his addiction issues. He was somebody who, during his stay in one of 15 different residential programs, he wound up going into a veterinarian clinic and stealing ketamine off the counter. And a nurse tried to grab him and a police officer tried to grab him. He pushed them and he came very close. He got charged with a pretty violent charge. He then violated probation several times and became very close to violating the 3 strikes law in California and going to prison for 5 to 7 years. We were able to get him out of that situation. He came eventually back home. Eventually, after several relapses, got to a point where he had about 4.5 years of sobriety. And last summer, hurt his back, wound up soliciting pain medications from a physician, and eventually relapsed and passed away from a fentanyl overdose last summer. So I come to this work, thank you very much. I come to this work from a family story. And I think it's a small example of, our family came from a fair amount of resources and we were able to afford the kind of treatment that Chris needed. But we also made a lot of mistakes along the way, partially because Chris was a very charismatic individual. And when he was in his worst moments, he would often say, hey, look, I'm leaving, treatment. I've got this under control. I'm going to go to AA, it's my recovery, leave me alone. And I think if you've worked with clients or you know someone that has an addiction or a mental health issue, a lot of families say, well, unless they hit, I don't know how many of you have heard this, unless they hit rock bottom, there's really nothing you can do. And our firm was very much founded on my brother's story to say, in many situations, not in all, but in many situations, there are some things you can do to raise the bottom to hopefully prevent increasing amounts of deaths in our country due to addiction. So I'm not a big stats person. I think there is no other way to put people to sleep, more so than putting a bunch of stats. I would also say since we started the company 8 years ago, these stats don't come as a surprise to anyone. If you pick up the New York Times, Boston Globe, there is always an article out there about rising suicide rates. So this statistic, it may be hard to read, states that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the US overall, and the second leading cause in people ages 10 to 34. We know that anxiety rates for people 10 to 14 have doubled since 2007. So we are in a period of time where we're seeing rises in mental health issues, as well as an opioid crisis, which is being publicized every day. So as advisors, the first question I get for people who are working in a wealth management capacity or in a legal capacity is sort of, how do we know if these issues are impacting family systems? Does anyone want to answer the question? Does anyone have an example they want to share? It's okay. All right, so we get a bunch of calls from advisors for all sorts of different reasons. Occasionally the call comes in because there's a major amount of money that has been taken, or there's a request for a distribution that's unusual. They're working with what we call an impaired beneficiary. Somebody is asking for $50,000. That's not the normal course of business. Sometimes the advisor is seeing it because nobody's asked for the money, but the family has said we need to pay this vendor, and again, it's an unusual vendor. It looks like some kind of medical expense, and that's an unusual one. I would say, and I think during the introduction we were talking about how close you get to your families. We see that a lot of advisors in their intimate relationship, not a lot of people in this country really feel comfortable talking to folks about money. So if you are in the kind of relationship with one of your clients where you're sharing information about money, you're talking about long-term planning, you're talking about protection of assets, it is not uncommon for families to come to you and say, what do? I'm trying to save for generations to come, and I have a child, or my child has a child who has some kind of issue, whether that's a special needs issue like autism, or whether it's an addiction issue that I'm concerned is not going to allow us to pass our assets from one generation to the next. Of course.
All right, Cammie's got it. Go
Okay.
ahead.
So my recommendation would be to ask and say, part of our job is to protect your assets long term. And something we've seen with families that can become an issue is if somebody has someone with special needs in their family system. So diagnoses like autism spectrum disorder, a mental health diagnosis, substance abuse. It's important for us to know this information, not to be nosy, but to be able to offer you the best care and to think about it as it applies to preserving your assets and making long-term changes to your trust documents. Something like that.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And we're done.
And you find out the answer, now what?
Yeah, now what? Well, and I think that's a very good point. So there's a slide later, but I'll tell you, whether it's our group, and I really mean this genuinely, or it's a family that you say, gosh, I know a really good therapist in town, why don't you go there and get an evaluation? I think to the point of what you're saying, having some kind of resource available is important, because where I think advisors get stuck and where I've seen things not go so well, even advisors with the best of intentions, if I were an advisor and I had my own family experience and a family member says, my son has an addiction issue, and I say, I know this great rehab, you have to send him here, and the family's not ready to do that, or the issues of that son are different than my son's, or they have a bad experience, there's all sorts of complicating factors. I always say, we're a firm that works with people while they have these issues. We don't have assets under management. If they don't need us, they don't need us and they fire us. Or they, kindly say we're no longer in need of your services. I think some advisors I've seen have gotten into stickier situations because they try to give advice, and then the family comes to them almost like a therapist, and then it's very hard when things get more difficult to kind of back out of that role, if it makes sense. And it's usually done with the best of intentions.
Have you seen legal issues because of
I have in one circumstance, only because I think it wasn't anything hugely significant, but in this example, the family sent somebody to a facility that the advisor had recommended. The experience wasn't great, and there was a question in the compliance department of the firms as to whether they bore any liability for making that recommendation. So, and it's a particularly conservative firm. So their answer was like, we'll never ask these questions again, which I don't think also is great either. So, so opportunities for conversations, we talked a little about this. The only other thing I would say, well, I'll get to that in a minute. These are in general where we see families having these conversations. So talks about family values. Estate planning is a big one. You know, trust and estate attorneys. I had my estate planning done, and boy, do they get in your business. So I think that's a natural one. And school failure, I bring that up because it is very hard. I don't know if anybody here has college-age children. Very hard to fail out of school in our country. Like very, very hard. You have to almost try to get kicked out of college. And if you have a loved one who gets asked to be on a medical leave due to some kind of substance use or mental health issue, it's extreme because the schools don't want to break privacy laws with somebody being over 18 and they don't want to have to tattle to parents. We actually see many more situations where the person is in a school setting, is having extremely problematic behaviors, but the parents don't know until things have gone completely off the rails. This gets a little bit to the question of like risks of staying quiet versus speaking up. We're seeing more and more people who are willing to get into these conversations because of the nature of their services that they're trying to offer to clients, and they're really trying to be a sort of partner to families in life. Certainly, it's hard to say that there are not risks to speaking up. You know, you could potentially be seen as overstepping boundaries. You could irritate somebody in the family. But we're starting to see just as many risks of staying quiet. You know, the risk that the issue continues to go unaddressed. In family businesses, I can tell you if somebody has a substance use issue, the most common thing we see is the family brings in a consultant to do these 360 evaluations. And as the person is just about to start the engagement, they say, oh yeah, by the way, Johnny is an alcoholic and we're going to need you to confront him on that during the evaluation process, which is such a setup for disaster. So approaching the subject, you know, we try to recommend some language. I always say this slide is the most relevant for families, but it has some advisor content as well. I'm a big fan of asking for permission, speaking in the first person. This is the one that's really for families. I noticed you drank 5 glasses of wine during an hour and I'm concerned, versus, you know, you've always been a loser, blah, blah, blah. Which you'd be surprised. You know, we do, our firm does interventions, and the amount of interventions I have talked to people about, and the family will call and say, okay, and the sister's on the phone, and she says, like, I'm very excited to get in the room and confront my brother because ever since he was a child, and I'll say, I'm going to stop you there. What do you, no, I just was going to say, I said, I know he probably got the kitten that you wanted, and he got the bottom bunk, and you always wanted. This is not the time to give every, recollection of ways he's wronged you. We have one goal here, and that's to get the addiction addressed and to move on. And if you can't get on board with that, we're going to have to have somebody else be present. Certainly offering help is a big one for families. One advisor that we do a bunch of business with said to a family, the family member came forward and said, one of the things I'm really struggling with is X. And he had a very simple phrase, which was, well, I'm not an expert in that, but I know someone who might be able to help. Do you want me to make an introduction? And it was a very simple handoff. I'm going to flip through these quickly. I think these are more, these are slides that talk a little bit about family resistance. And I think, one of the ones that I will point out is using crisis as an opportunity. When somebody gets arrested or gets put into a hospital system or gets kicked out of school, families are obviously understandably very upset about those kind of crises. But for many families that are in denial or have been reluctant to address these issues over the long term, I think those are the moments that somebody can say to them, whether that's you or whether it's a family member's, what would need to happen for you to change your mind about making a call here, or how does we say it here? What would need to happen for you to consider making a change? I find that to be, those moments, I think, for families can often be come to Jesus moments where they say, oh boy, this has really gotten out of control. I will also say, we deal with some people who, our hardest cases are patriarchs who have access to the capital and have the issue, because wives are afraid to bring it up. I'm making a big generalization here, but wives are typically nervous because they don't want to be cut off from the finances. They don't want to lose their husband. They don't want to have to get a divorce. Children are nervous if they're receiving funds from the parents. And so one of the things we've had to do, and I'll just go back quickly, is present options. So for somebody who's the CEO running a big family, conglomerate business, we often will say, we would like you to go get help tomorrow. Here's one option for care and here's another. And we've done some pretty creative arrangements in some circumstances where the person is stable enough to keep them in their home and live with one of our companions for a period of time rather than going into an institution. Or we will give them 4 different treatment options. Sometimes we'll allow them to get on the phone and talk to them so that they don't feel like it's all been taken out of their hands. And I'd say that's particularly powerful for people who are older and have a lot of pride about addressing the issue. I'm going to keep going here. So long-term treatment, I think one of the things I like to point out here, and it certainly was true in our situation, is it's important to address the entire family system. So the individual, him or herself, is going to have to get a diagnosis, get care for that issue, start to develop a sense of purpose, start to figure out how are they going to go home and engage in a better way of living, which sounds easy. Parents assume if somebody goes into treatment, or family members assume 30 days they're going to come out. It's like getting surgery at a hospital. They're going to come out a brand new person. That isn't how life is. People come back home. The same stressors that existed before are still there. They often have a community of friends. I just met with someone this morning who's a professional now in the addiction industry, and he's sober. He lives here on the South Shore, and he was saying to me, I had to get a whole new group of friends, basically. He's like, I have 2 friends that are left over from high school, but everybody else is really uncomfortable with me now that I can't drink. So life completely changes, and it's important for just as much as that individual needs help, it's also important for parents and family members to get help. I'll tell you, there's a lot of focus on how do parents feel, how do they set boundaries, but even as a sibling of somebody who had an addictive disorder, my brother Matt, even before he got into recovery, used to say, there's no oxygen in the room to talk about my issues, because Chris, all the attention is focused on Chris and what needs to happen with him and the next crisis that happens with him. So challenges for advisors. Legal, I'm not an attorney, but these are some of the things that we've heard from advisors. Trust documents with sobriety clauses, very unclear as to who's monitoring, what defines whether someone's sober. If it says you have to determine whether they're sober, are they drug testing the person in their office? We get a lot of clients who will come out of a detox, which is 72 hours usually, where you're just literally cleaning out your system, and they'll say, well, I'm sober now, I can receive my distribution. So we've seen a lot of attorneys who've hired us as distribution advisors to help them sort out what options for care should they be considering. Absolute discretion on the other end of the spectrum in a trust. On the one hand, it gives the trustee a lot of discretion, obviously, and a lot of choices as to how they monitor someone, but it can be so vague that for people without a lot of specific knowledge in this area, it can often feel way too complicated for them to make choices. On the clinical end, navigating the system is a huge issue. I could do a whole presentation on this, but there's a ton of private equity money that's moved into the behavioral health space. So Carlyle, as an example, the private equity group out of New York, bought Newport Academy, which is a chain of treatment centers for adolescents with addiction and mental health issues. That's not a bad thing. It's actually been, I think, a big boon to their business. I think they've helped professionalize the service. But what it means is that there's a lot more money poured into digital advertising. There's a lot more competition for beds for people who have good commercial insurance plans or who can afford to pay out of pocket. And so navigating the system, if you just Google help for addiction, you are going to come up with every site. All of them are going to look the same. It's gotten to the point that Google actually had to redo the way they allow you to buy words around substance use because it was getting so abused. Facilities were taking logos from other facilities to try and steal their branding and routing you to a call center in another place. There's some pretty crazy stuff out there. And the other piece about navigating the system that's hard is if you have an unwilling client, what do? You could have the best psychiatrist in the world a block away, but what happens if the person says, I'm just not doing it? Managing crises, it's probably the biggest complaint we hear from trustees and other types of advisors. Like, I'm getting calls all day long. He's really aggressive. I don't know what to say. And then financial oversight. Do you guys use TrueLink? Have you heard of this card before? So it's a credit card that allows you to turn it on and off. We use it a lot with people who have overspending issues. You can prohibit certain vendors from being able to be utilized. It's great for the family who has the best of intentions, but is just constantly giving money to their loved one without a lot of restrictions on it. So we've used it to manage people who have addiction issues, and certainly people who have bipolar and other issues that cause them to overspend. So tools for advisors to consider. One of the things we talked a little bit about distribution advisors, consultants obviously can be helpful. One of the things I wanted to point out is hosting a client event. As much as that may sound a little bananas, again, back to like most events that I've seen with clients have cocktails in the back, and there's nothing that ruins the mood like than having someone get up there and rave about the challenges with addiction prior. But we're seeing an increasing amount of wealth management firms that have done a session at lunch on the opioid crisis, or a session over dinner around how do we manage affluent individuals, or how do we make sure your children are raised in healthy, positive ways if they don't want to really name these issues. And some firms that are willing to say, how do we make sure our kids are raised with positive mental health habits? So last couple slides here. One of the reasons we exist is frankly because of this long list. This is sort of, and I'm not going to go through these one by one because again, I don't want everyone to fall asleep, but the overview of clinical options, when people talk about, okay, I need my child to go into care, care can be everything from a traditional rehab to a wilderness program to seeing an individual therapist. And I call this the gobbledygook of social worker language. It is for a family that didn't have any therapists in it. When somebody said, well, he needs to get help, welcome to the world of, who treats what, how do we know it's working, where do we start, and who talks to who. So I'm going to do a couple of last slides on us, and then I will be quiet, hopefully, for the remainder of the day. We were founded 8 years ago. We work primarily domestically, but we've done a little bit of international work with clients, largely who are U.S. citizens but have traveled abroad. We have 15 full-time employees, 120 part-time. We basically have a mix of clinical professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health counselors, social workers. And we really are focused on getting people to longer-term plans. Like, it gets back to the point that I made about 30 days of recovery. So people, oftentimes families will say, we just need you to intervene, get my daughter to the facility, and then things will be great. And that is not the experience of many families. So really trying to think about addiction. The best markers for addiction are after a year of sobriety, your statistics for long-term sobriety go way up, and after 5 years, they get better than 90%. So the more there can be clinical supports with accountability measures like drug testing, alcohol monitoring, the better shot you have at somebody having a long-term successful outcome. So our services, we don't do individual therapy despite having a big clinical team, but we'll vet facilities for folks. We'll create an on-the-ground provider team. Has anyone heard the term of an in-home companion, a sober companion before? Elementary, if you've watched the show, the Sherlock Holmes, I haven't watched it, so the Sherlock Holmes character, as I understand it, has a companion, Lucy Liu. Ours don't all look like Lucy Liu, but we have companions who actually live with people who need very intensive support. We also do interventions. They're not all like the TV show where people pop out of closets, but we have people who will go in and facilitate a meeting to try and set some boundaries and get someone into care. And then we do a variety of different consultations and placements. So last few takeaways, behavioral health issues are chronic diseases. They need a long-term investment by a professional that is directing the process. Certainly, we talked a little bit about the questionable practices in the field. I mean, bottom line, I think if you were to refer your clients, the things you need to be looking for are a group of professionals that have expertise with what the diagnosis is, a way to introduce situations. And people always ask, people call us all day long, whether they're going to use our service or not, to say, this is a situation I'm facing. How would you suggest I go back to the family member? And we're happy to try and troubleshoot it on the phone, because each scenario is a little bit different depending on what the family system's views are, who in the family has the issue, and how much has been disclosed. So that is the presentation.
Pretty good, if you ask me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if Antonio Brown's family hired her, he'd probably still have a job. Some pretty good